Elena Warren has dedicated her life to fighting for the voiceless, but when she witnesses a young boy silently endure cruel harassment from a bus driver, her past and present collide in ways she never expected. Jamal, an 11-year-old black boy, sits in quiet resilience, haunted by secrets he refuses to share. As Elena digs deeper, she uncovers layers of guilt, racism, and family ties that shake her to the core. With each revelation, Elena's resolve to protect Jamal intensifies, but the truth she uncovers connects to her own painful past and a secret that could shatter everything. In a story where justice and redemption are blurred, Silent Courage explores the power of silence, the price of truth, and the courage it takes to confront both. Will Elena expose the evil lurking beneath the surface, or will her quest for justice cost her more than she ever imagined? The bus rattled down the familiar street, its hum and occasional screech fading into the background as Elena stared out the window. She sat near the front, her usual spot, a book tucked in her lap, though she wasn't reading. Her mind, as always, was preoccupied with the tasks of the day. Phone calls to make, families to visit, children to check on. Elena let out a sigh, her gaze drifting lazily over the other passengers. That's when she noticed him, Jamal. He was small, sitting quietly near the back of the bus, shoulders hunched forward, hands in his pockets. It wasn't his posture that caught her attention. It was the way Frank, the bus driver, glanced back at him. Frank's look wasn't just dismissive. It was filled with something darker, something Elena recognized. The subtle curl of his lip, the slight narrowing of his eyes as he stared at the boy, reminded Elena of the way people had once looked at her brother. That sharp, judgmental gaze that cut through innocence, labeling and condemning with just a glance. Jamal looked up, meeting Frank's gaze for a second before casting his eyes back to his shoes, silent and unmoving. Why isn't he sitting up front? Elena thought. There were plenty of empty seats ahead, but Frank hadn't called him forward, hadn't even bothered to acknowledge the boy's presence beyond that hateful look. It unsettled her, but she stayed silent. As her stop approached, Elena grabbed her bag and stepped off the bus, throwing one last glance toward Jamal. His expression hadn't changed, and neither had Frank's. "Elena, you in?" A colleague's voice brought her back to the present as she sat in the community center's break room. A cup of coffee sat untouched beside her, and files were scattered across the table. Elena blinked, shaking off the unease that had followed her from the bus. "Yeah, sorry," she said, closing the file in front of her. "Just distracted." Her coworker, Maria, raised an eyebrow. "Something on your mind?" Elena hesitated, fingers tapping absently against the table. "It's nothing. Just a kid I saw on the bus this morning. He seemed off." "Off how?" "I don't know. There was this look. The bus driver, it wasn't right. And the kid, he just sat there, like he was used to it." Maria frowned, leaning forward. "You think something's going on with him?" Elena shrugged, but the image of Frank's harsh stare wouldn't leave her mind. "Maybe. I don't know him, but his name's Jamal. I've seen him before. He gets on the same bus every day." Maria's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Jamal, that name rings a bell. I think his mom used to come here for help." Elena perked up. "Really?" "Yeah, Deborah, I think. But she stopped coming a while back. I'm not sure why." A tight knot formed in Elena's stomach. "I think I need to find out more about him." "Maybe it's nothing," Maria offered, but Elena shook her head. The next morning, Elena boarded the bus again, scanning the seats. Jamal was there, as usual, sitting quietly at the back, his hands still in his pockets. She moved a few rows closer this time, trying not to be too obvious, though her eyes kept flickering toward him. Frank glanced back at Jamal again, this time more openly hostile. He slammed the door shut after the last passenger boarded and began driving, but there was a deliberate slowness to his movements. At each stop, he took longer than necessary, purposely delaying, and Elena could see Jamal glancing nervously at the clock. He was going to be late for school. Elena's hand clenched around the strap of her bag. It was subtle, so subtle that most people wouldn't notice. But she saw it. Frank was deliberately trying to make Jamal late. A small, cruel act of power. Jamal remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor, not daring to speak up. There was a tension in his small frame, a kind of quiet endurance that Elena recognized. It was the same posture her brother used to have when he came home from school, eyes down, never wanting to talk about what had happened. The bus pulled up to Jamal's stop, and Frank paused just long enough to make the boy glance anxiously at the door before he opened it. Jamal hurried out, his shoulders still hunched, moving quickly down the sidewalk toward his school. As the bus continued, Elena's frustration grew. She had to do something. That evening, Elena sat in her apartment, the dim light from the lamp casting soft shadows across the room. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of tea, but the warmth did little to ease the chill of the memory creeping back into her mind. Her brother, Aaron, had been like Jamal, quiet, resilient, never complained. Even when the kids at school started calling him names, even when they threw things at him, even when the teachers turned a blind eye, Aaron had suffered in silence, just like Jamal. And then one day, it had all been too much. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, pushing back the sting of tears. She couldn't save Aaron. She had tried. God, she had tried. But it wasn't enough. By the time she had really understood what was happening, it was too late. She wouldn't let that happen again. Not with Jamal. Setting her cup down, Elena grabbed her phone and opened a search engine. She typed in Jamal Richardson, hoping to find something, anything that could tell her more about the boy and what was going on in his life. The next morning, Elena was on the bus again. But this time, she wasn't just observing. She was determined. She had found out enough to know that Jamal lived with his mother, Deborah Richardson, who worked 2 jobs and had once come to the community center for assistance. There was no father in the picture, no other family around to help. Jamal was alone in more ways than one. When he boarded the bus, Elena smiled gently at him and motioned to the seat beside her. Jamal hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Frank, who was glaring at them through the rearview mirror. "It's okay," Elena said softly. "You can sit here." Jamal shuffled over, sitting down but keeping his eyes downcast. "How are you today?" Elena asked, keeping her voice light. Jamal didn't respond at first, his shoulders tense. After a long pause, he muttered, "Fine." Elena didn't push. She simply sat with him, letting him know with her presence that he wasn't alone. The bus rumbled along, and Frank's glares grew more pronounced, but Elena didn't care. She was in this now. As they neared Jamal's stop, Elena spoke again. "If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here. You can come by the community center, or just talk to me on the bus. Whenever you're ready." Jamal didn't look at her, but there was a brief flicker of something in his expression. Maybe hope, maybe relief. He mumbled a soft, "Okay," before hurriedly getting off the bus. Elena watched him go, her resolve firming. She didn't know what Frank's deal was yet, but she was going to find out. And she was going to make sure Jamal didn't have to endure it alone. Elena sat at her desk in the quiet of the community center, her fingers typing a name into the search bar, Jamal Richardson. The image of his downcast eyes and slumped shoulders stayed with her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more beneath the surface. After her brief interaction with him on the bus, she knew she had to do something. A few articles popped up. Most were innocuous, school event mentions, nothing that offered much insight into his life. But then, she found a record, Deborah Richardson, his mother. There was a small note about her having received assistance from the center several years ago. Maria passed by, glancing at Elena's screen. "Are you still thinking about that boy from the bus?" she asked, folding her arms. "I am," Elena replied. "I looked up his family. His mother's been here before, but she stopped coming a few years ago. I think something's going on with them." Maria frowned. "Deborah Richardson? I think I remember her. She used to come in regularly, but she dropped off our radar pretty quickly." "Why?" Elena asked. "Not sure. Maybe the situation at home got worse." Elena leaned back in her chair. "I'm going to look into it. I want to help them." "You always do," Maria said with a knowing smile. "Just be careful. You know how these things can go." Elena nodded, her mind already racing. "I know, but I have to try." Elena wasn't expecting to run into Deborah that afternoon, but there she was at the small grocery store near the community center, scanning the aisles with an exhausted look. Elena's heart skipped a beat. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Deborah," she called gently. Deborah turned, and for a moment, a flicker of recognition crossed her face. Her eyes widened slightly as she put the pieces together. "Elena, right? From the community center?" Deborah asked, her voice guarded but polite. "Yes, it's been a while," Elena said, offering a warm smile. "I was actually just thinking about you and Jamal." Deborah's face stiffened at the mention of her son. "Is everything okay? Did something happen?" she asked, her voice immediately tense. "Nothing happened," Elena assured her. "I see Jamal sometimes on the bus. I wanted to check in, see if there's anything you need. I remember you coming to the center a few years ago, and I just wanted to see how things were going." Deborah's eyes dropped, and she let out a soft sigh. "We're fine. Just busy. I don't have much time for anything else these days." Elena could sense the hesitation, the walls Deborah had built around herself and her family. But she couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to it. "If you ever need anything, resources, help with Jamal's school, anything at all, you know where to find me," Elena said gently. Deborah nodded, her voice soft. "I appreciate that. Really. But we're okay." Elena didn't push further, but as she walked away, she couldn't help but feel the weight of Deborah's struggle. Whatever was going on in their home, it was clear that Deborah was carrying more than she could handle. The following day, Elena was back on the bus, her eyes finding Jamal the moment he stepped on. She motioned for him to sit next to her again, but this time, Jamal hesitated longer than before. Eventually, he shuffled over, sliding into the seat without looking at her. "Hey, Jamal," Elena said, trying to keep her voice light and casual. "How's school going?" Jamal shrugged, his eyes fixed on the floor. "It's fine." Elena could feel the walls he had built around himself, the same ones she had seen in Deborah. She tried again. "If you ever want to talk about anything, I'm here. You can tell me if something's bothering you." But Jamal just shook his head, his hands gripping the edges of his jacket tightly. "I don't need help. I'm fine." The defensiveness in his tone took Elena aback. He wasn't just being quiet, he was pushing her away. It was clear that whatever was going on, Jamal had learned to cope by shutting people out. "I'm not trying to push," Elena said gently. "I just want you to know that you're not alone." Jamal's posture stiffened even more, and he muttered under his breath, "I don't need anyone." The bus stopped, and before Elena could say anything more, Jamal was up and out of his seat, rushing off the bus. Elena watched him go, frustration bubbling inside her. Jamal's refusal to open up was more than just shyness, it was fear. She could sense it. Later that day, as Elena rode the bus back to the community center, her attention was fixed on Frank. She had noticed how he looked at Jamal before, but now, her focus was sharper. Every glance, every scowl Frank threw in Jamal's direction seemed deliberate, like there was a personal vendetta behind his actions. At one stop, Jamal boarded the bus late, clearly out of breath. As soon as Frank saw him, his eyes narrowed. He didn't even look at the other passengers. He slammed the door shut with a loud, aggressive clank, and the bus jolted forward, making everyone lurch in their seats. Jamal's face was emotionless, but Elena could see his fingers twitching at his sides. Frank drove slower than usual, dragging out the journey with obvious intent. Elena watched as Jamal checked his watch anxiously, knowing he was going to be late for school. When the bus finally arrived at Jamal's stop, Frank didn't open the door right away. He let the bus idle for a few extra seconds, long enough for Jamal to look up in confusion. Then, with an almost sinister smirk, Frank pressed the button, and the door creaked open. Jamal got off without a word, his shoulders hunched even more than usual. Elena felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. Frank's cruelty wasn't just about making the boy late. It was about power, about control. She needed to know why Frank had singled Jamal out. Back at the community center, Elena decided to dig deeper. She pulled up her computer, her fingers moving quickly across the keys. Frank O'Connor. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew there had to be more to his hostility. The search results that came up were unexpected. Frank had been a bus driver for over 20 years, but there was a dark spot on his record. A news article from several years ago mentioned an incident involving Frank, a confrontation with a black passenger that had resulted in an internal investigation. The details were vague, but it seemed like Frank had been accused of using racial slurs during the altercation. The investigation had been quietly closed, and Frank had kept his job. Elena's heart sank. This wasn't just about Jamal. Frank had a history, and it seemed like his hatred ran deep. Her mind raced as she pieced together what she had learned so far. Frank's hostility, Jamal's silence, Deborah's exhaustion. It was all connected. But how deeply did the roots of this situation go? As Elena closed her computer, she made a decision. She needed to dig even further. There was something hidden in Frank's past, and she had to uncover it if she was going to help Jamal. Elena sat in her office at the community center, her fingers tapping against the desk as she waited for her contact, Melissa, to join the call. Melissa was a social worker in another part of the city, and Elena hoped she could provide more insight into Jamal's background. The phone rang, and Melissa's voice crackled through. "Elena, good to hear from you. What's going on?" Elena leaned forward, speaking quickly. "Hey, Melissa. I'm working with a boy named Jamal Richardson. He's been through a lot, and I'm trying to piece things together. I found out his father disappeared years ago, and I was wondering if you knew anything about it." There was a pause on the other end. Jamal Richardson. I remember that name. His father's disappearance was a big deal back then, but it never made the news. Word around the community was that the police didn't look too hard for him. It was suspicious. Suspicious how? Elena's pulse quickened. From what I heard, Jamal's dad had been involved in some activism. He was vocal about police brutality in the neighborhood, and some people think that had something to do with him disappearing. Elena felt her stomach twist. You're saying the police might have been involved? It wouldn't be the first time something like that happened in this city, Melissa said, her tone darkening. Jamal's family never got closure. His mom, Deborah, stopped asking questions when she realized no one was going to help. It's heartbreaking. Elena's mind raced. If Jamal's father had been a target, that might explain why Frank's hatred ran so deep. But what was Frank's role in all of this? Thanks for the info, Melissa. This helps more than you know. Be careful, Elena, Melissa warned. If you're digging into this, you might not like what you find. That evening, Elena knocked on the door of Deborah's small apartment. It was late, and the soft glow of the street lamp cast long shadows across the worn steps. She heard shuffling inside before the door creaked open. Deborah stood there, looking tired, but her expression softened when she saw Elena. Elena, what brings you here at this hour? I wanted to talk about Jamal's father, Elena said, stepping inside. I know it's not easy, but I think I'm starting to understand what happened. And I think it's connected to why Jamal is being harassed. Deborah's face tightened. She crossed her arms defensively, leaning against the counter. Why are you bringing this up now? It's been years. I think the man harassing Jamal, Frank, might know something about your husband's disappearance, Elena said softly. I don't know how, but the pieces are starting to fit. Deborah stared at her, the weight of the years evident in her eyes. For a moment, she said nothing, but then her shoulders slumped. I loved him so much, Deborah whispered, her voice trembling. Jamal's father was a good man. He fought for justice, for our people, even when no one else would. He wouldn't stay quiet, even when it put him in danger. Tears welled in her eyes. When he disappeared, I was devastated. I asked the police for help, but they didn't care. They told me he probably ran off, left me and Jamal behind. But I knew better. I knew something happened to him because of what he was fighting for. Elena moved closer, her heart aching for Deborah. I'm sorry. You've carried this for so long. Deborah wiped her eyes. I stopped asking questions because I had to focus on raising Jamal. I couldn't fight the system anymore. But now it's affecting my son. Frank, what does he have to do with this? I don't know yet, Elena admitted, but I promise I'll find out. The next morning, Elena boarded the bus as usual, her eyes immediately searching for Jamal. He was there, sitting at the back, as always. But something was different today. There was a heaviness in the air, an unspoken tension that made Elena's skin crawl. She moved toward the back, sitting a few rows ahead of him. Jamal, she called softly. Jamal looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in days. There was something in his gaze, a plea, though he didn't speak it out loud. Elena shifted closer, speaking gently. I've been talking to your mom. She told me about your father. Jamal's eyes flickered, but he remained silent. I'm going to find out what happened, Elena continued, and I'm going to make sure this stops. Jamal swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. You can't, he muttered, his voice barely audible. What do you mean? Elena asked. Jamal looked away, his voice shaking. If you try, things will get worse. For my mom. For me. Elena's heart sank. She reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. I won't let that happen. You deserve better than this, Jamal. He didn't respond, but the fear in his eyes told Elena everything she needed to know. Jamal wasn't just afraid of Frank. He was afraid of what the truth might cost them. Later that day, as Elena stepped off the bus, Frank called after her, his voice sharp. Warren. She froze, turning to face him. His eyes were narrowed, his face tight with anger. You think I don't know what you're doing? He growled, stepping closer. You've been digging around, asking questions you have no business asking. Elena stood her ground, her pulse quickening. I'm just trying to help Jamal. Frank's lips twisted into a sneer. You need to stay out of it. You have no idea what you're messing with. Elena crossed her arms, her voice steady. I know more than you think. I know about Jamal's father, and I know you're involved. Frank's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Elena saw something flash behind his expression. Guilt, fear. She couldn't be sure. You don't know anything, he spat. And if you keep this up, you're going to regret it. Elena didn't flinch. Maybe I will, but I'm not stopping. Frank glared at her, his hands clenched into fists. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? You're not. You're just making things worse. With that, he turned and stalked back to the bus, leaving Elena standing there, her heart racing. She had pushed him, but the real question was, what would he do next? Elena hurried into the community center, her mind racing. She found Maria in the break room, sipping coffee, and quickly pulled her aside. Maria, I need your help, Elena said, her voice urgent. Maria raised an eyebrow, setting down her cup. What's going on? I've been digging into Frank's past, and I think he's involved in something much bigger. Something connected to Jamal's father's disappearance. Maria's eyes widened. Are you serious? What have you found? Elena explained everything. The conversation with Deborah, the confrontation with Frank. As she spoke, Maria's expression grew more serious. This sounds dangerous, Elena, Maria said softly. You're dealing with people who've gotten away with this for years. If Frank is involved in something bigger, he's not going to let you expose him. I know, Elena replied, her voice steady, but I can't back down now. I need to find out the truth. For Jamal, for his family. Maria studied her for a moment before nodding. All right, I'm with you. But we need to be smart about this. If Frank's hiding something, we'll need proof. Elena nodded, her resolve solidifying. Then let's find it. Elena sat near the front of the bus, her eyes fixed on Frank as he drove. The tension was palpable. She could feel it in the air, a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. Jamal was at the back, as usual, his small frame hunched over, his face turned toward the window. Frank had been quieter than usual, but the looks he cast toward Jamal were filled with the same cold disdain. Each stop seemed to stretch longer than the last, and Elena could sense the passengers growing impatient. But none of them said a word. It was as though everyone on that bus had become accustomed to the unspoken hostility that simmered between Frank and Jamal. Jamal's stop was approaching, and Elena could see him tensing, preparing for the moment Frank would deliberately hold the door just a second too long, enough to make him late. As the bus slowed, Elena felt her pulse quicken. This time, she couldn't stay silent. She stood up and walked toward the back of the bus, taking a seat next to Jamal. Hey, she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. You don't have to sit back here alone. Jamal glanced at her, his eyes wide with surprise, but he didn't respond. The bus came to a stop, and, as expected, Frank hesitated before opening the door. Elena turned her gaze to the front. Open the door, Frank, she said, her voice carrying across the silent bus. Frank's head jerked in her direction, his jaw tight. For a moment, he didn't move, the tension between them thick and suffocating. But then, with a reluctant huff, he pressed the button, and the door creaked open. Jamal hurried off the bus without a word, and Elena watched him disappear down the street, her chest tight with frustration. She had to do something. This couldn't continue. That evening, Elena made her way to Deborah's apartment. Her thoughts raced as she climbed the stairs, her mind replaying the scene on the bus. Jamal was retreating further into himself, and Frank's hostility was becoming more overt. She had to get through to Deborah. Deborah opened the door, her face weary but surprised to see Elena. "Elena? Is something wrong?" she asked, stepping aside to let her in. Elena wasted no time. "I need to talk to you about Frank." Deborah's face immediately fell, her expression turning guarded. "What about him?" she asked, her voice tight. "I know you're afraid to confront him, but Jamal's getting worse," Elena said, her tone urgent. "Frank's harassment isn't just about control, it's personal. And I think it has to do with what happened to Jamal's father." Deborah's eyes darkened. She shook her head, retreating toward the kitchen. "You don't understand," she muttered, her voice trembling. Elena followed her, her heart aching as she watched Deborah's hands tremble as she gripped the countertop. "I do understand, Deborah. I've seen the same thing before. You're trying to protect Jamal, but staying silent isn't protecting him anymore." Deborah let out a choked sob, her shoulders shaking. "What am I supposed to do? Confront my father? You don't know what he's capable of, Elena." "I know he's hurting your son," Elena said softly, "and if we don't stop him, it's only going to get worse." Deborah wiped her eyes, turning to face Elena. "I'm scared, Elena. I'm scared of what he'll do if I stand up to him." Elena placed a gentle hand on Deborah's arm. "You're not alone in this. I'm here with you. But we have to act now, before it's too late." The next day, Elena sat near the front of the bus again, her eyes on Frank. He hadn't acknowledged her since their last confrontation, but she could feel his anger simmering beneath the surface. He was waiting for the right moment to lash out. As the bus pulled into the depot for the midday break, Elena waited until the last passenger stepped off before standing up and walking toward the front. "Frank," she called, her voice firm. Frank grunted, not bothering to look at her. "What do you want?" Elena crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "I want to know why you hate Jamal so much." Frank's hands tightened around the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "You wouldn't understand," he muttered. "Try me," Elena said, taking a step closer. "I know about Jamal's father. I know you had something to do with his disappearance." At that, Frank's head snapped up, his eyes wide with shock and fury. "You don't know anything," he spat. "I know enough," Elena replied. "I know that you're hiding something, and I'm going to find out what it is." Frank let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? Digging into things you shouldn't. But you don't know the half of it." Elena's heart raced, but she kept her voice steady. "Then tell me, what happened?" Frank's face twisted with a mix of anger and guilt. "He got what he deserved," he muttered under his breath. He didn't know when to keep his mouth shut. Elena's breath caught in her throat. "What did you do, Frank?" Frank glared at her, his eyes filled with years of buried rage. "I didn't do anything, but I kept quiet. I covered for the people who did." The next morning, Elena was back on the bus, but something had shifted. She could feel the tension building, like the calm before a storm. Jamal was sitting at the back, as always, his head down. But today, there was a flicker of something else in his posture, determination. The bus came to a stop, and as the doors opened, a group of kids got off. When Frank glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes locked onto Jamal's. It was the same cold, hateful look, but this time, something different happened. Jamal stood up. Elena's heart raced as she watched the boy make his way toward the front of the bus. He didn't stop at the middle, where he usually sat. He kept walking, his eyes fixed straight ahead, until he reached the front row. Without a word, Jamal sat down in the seat directly behind Frank. Frank's face turned red, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly Elena thought it might snap in half. But he said nothing. The bus was silent, save for the low hum of the engine. Elena felt a surge of pride. Jamal had made his stand, even if it was in silence. That evening, Elena sat in a small cafe with Nina, a journalist friend she had contacted earlier that week. Nina had promised to help dig up any information she could find about Frank's past, and Elena was eager to hear what she'd uncovered. Nina took a sip of her coffee before pulling out a folder and sliding it across the table. "You were right," she said quietly. "Frank was involved in a cover-up years ago. A black man was killed during a police raid, Jamal's father." Elena's heart sank as she opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. What happened? The official report says it was an accident, but there were witnesses who claimed the police targeted him because he was leading protests against racial injustice. Frank wasn't directly involved, but he was the bus driver for the precinct, and he helped cover it up. Elena's hands shook as she closed the folder. So Jamal's father was a victim of the same system Frank protected. Nina nodded, her expression grim. It's all coming full circle. Frank's guilt is eating him alive, but he's too proud to admit it. He's been taking it out on Jamal. Elena stared at the folder, the weight of the truth settling over her like a heavy fog. She had uncovered the darkness that connected Frank to Jamal's past, but now she had to decide what to do with it. The door to the community center creaked open, and Elena looked up from her desk to see Jamal standing in the doorway. His eyes were downcast, his shoulders tense. He had never come here before, not without his mother, and certainly not without a word. But now, here he was, silent, but present. Elena stood and walked toward him. "Jamal," she said softly, trying not to overwhelm him with her concern. "What's going on? Why are you here?" He glanced up at her, and though he didn't say anything, his eyes told the story. He was scared, uncertain, and desperate for something. Anything to change. "I'm here," Elena assured him. "You don't have to do this alone." Jamal's lips parted, and for the first time, he whispered, "It's too much. I can't." He cut himself off, looking at the floor as though he regretted saying anything. Elena knelt in front of him, her voice steady. "You don't have to carry this by yourself. I know things have been hard, but we're going to figure it out, okay?" Jamal swallowed hard, blinking back the tears threatening to spill over. He nodded, but the weight of his silence hung in the air like a suffocating blanket. Elena knew this was his cry for help, the kind of plea that didn't need words. It was a signal that things were coming to a head. "Let's talk," Elena said gently. "Let me help." Later that day, Elena sat with Deborah in the small, cluttered kitchen of their apartment. Jamal had retreated to his room, the door softly closed behind him. Deborah was on edge, her hands trembling slightly as she poured tea for the two of them. "Elena," Deborah began, her voice cracking with emotion. "Jamal's been holding so much inside, and I didn't even realize how bad it had gotten." "He's scared," Elena said, keeping her tone gentle but firm. "He's scared of Frank. He's scared of what it could mean if the truth comes out. And honestly, Deborah, I think he's scared for you, too." Deborah let out a heavy sigh, setting her tea down without taking a sip. "I've always been scared of my father," she admitted. "I left because I couldn't bear the way he treated Jamal's father. And now, it feels like everything I ran from is catching up to us." Elena nodded, feeling the weight of Deborah's confession. "I know this is hard, but you need to confront him. Jamal needs to see that you're willing to stand up for him. It's the only way to break this cycle." Tears filled Deborah's eyes, and she shook her head. "How do I even begin? How do I face a man who's done nothing but hurt the people I love?" "You start by being honest," Elena said softly. "He can't control you anymore. He can't control Jamal. But you need to take that power back." Deborah wiped her eyes, nodding slowly. "You're right. I've been too afraid for too long." "I'll be there with you," Elena promised. "You won't have to face him alone." That evening, Deborah called her father. The conversation was brief, tense, and ended with a simple arrangement. They would meet at his house the following day to talk. The next morning, Deborah and Jamal sat in the car outside Frank's small, rundown house. Elena was with them, her presence a quiet reassurance. "I'm scared," Jamal whispered, his voice shaking as he looked at the house through the car window. "I know," Elena said gently, her hand resting on his shoulder. "But you don't have to say anything. Just know that we're here for you." Deborah took a deep breath and opened the car door, stepping out into the cold air. Jamal followed, and together, the three of them made their way to the front door. Frank opened it before they knocked. He stood in the doorway, his face hard, his eyes narrowing when he saw Elena. "What is this?" Frank asked, his voice gruff. "Why are you all here?" Deborah stepped forward, her voice steady despite her fear. "We need to talk, Dad. About Jamal. About everything." Frank's eyes flicked to Jamal, and for a moment, his expression softened. But it was quickly replaced by his usual anger. "What's there to talk about? I'm doing the best I can." "The best you can?" Deborah's voice rose, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "The best you can has been tormenting my son. You've been trying to break him, just like you tried to break his father." Frank's face went pale, and he took a step back. "That's not—" "Don't lie," Deborah shouted. "You hated Jamal's father because he was a black man. You couldn't stand the fact that I loved him, that I had a child with him. And now you're taking it out on Jamal." Frank's eyes darted between Deborah, Jamal, and Elena. For the first time, he looked truly cornered. I didn't want this," Frank muttered, his voice barely audible. I just couldn't stop seeing him every time I looked at Jamal." Deborah's eyes filled with tears. "You let your hate destroy this family, Dad. You let it eat you alive." Frank's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, the years of guilt seemed to wash over him all at once. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he whispered. After the confrontation, Elena and Deborah sat on the steps outside Frank's house, the weight of everything that had just unfolded pressing down on them like a heavy cloud. Deborah's eyes were red, and her voice was barely a whisper. "I didn't think he'd admit it. I didn't think he had it in him." Elena nodded slowly. "Sometimes guilt is too much to carry, but that doesn't make what he did any less terrible." Deborah looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling. "What do we do now?" Elena sighed, feeling the weight of the decision before them. "I've spent so long fighting for justice, for people like Jamal and his father. I've always believed that the truth needs to come out, no matter the cost." "But?" Deborah asked, sensing the hesitation in Elena's voice. Elena looked at her, conflicted. "But exposing Frank might destroy what little is left of your family. It could rip everything apart. And Jamal. I think he's already been through enough." Deborah's voice was tight with emotion. "I don't know if I can forgive him for what he's done, but I also don't know if I can handle losing him completely." Elena reached out, placing a comforting hand on Deborah's arm. "This is your decision. You need to do what's right for you and Jamal." As the sun began to set, Jamal emerged from the house, his face pale but calm. He walked over to where Elena and his mother sat, his expression unreadable. "Jamal," Elena said gently, "you heard everything. What do you want to do?" Jamal sat down next to his mother, staring at his hands for a long moment before finally speaking. "I don't want to tell anyone," he said quietly. "Telling people what Grandpa did. It won't bring Dad back, and it won't make things better for us." Deborah's breath caught in her throat, and she wrapped an arm around Jamal, pulling him close. "Are you sure?" she whispered. Jamal nodded. "Yeah, I just want us to be okay. I want things to be different, but I don't want to hurt anyone else." Elena watched them, her heart aching with a mix of emotions. Jamal's choice was a form of courage she hadn't expected, a decision not to fight, not because he was afraid, but because he understood that some battles weren't worth the cost. "I respect your decision, Jamal," Elena said softly, "and I'll be here to help you and your mom, no matter what." Jamal nodded, leaning into his mother's embrace. In that moment, Elena realized that sometimes justice wasn't about punishment. Sometimes it was about healing, about choosing the path that brought the least harm. As they sat together in the fading light, Elena felt a quiet sense of resolution settle over them. The truth was out, and though it wouldn't be easy, they had found a way forward. A way that honored Jamal's quiet strength and his family's fragile peace. Elena sat in her apartment, the soft glow of the evening sun filtering through the window. Her eyes traced the lines of the old photograph on the table, the one of her brother, Aaron. His bright smile, full of hope, seemed so distant now, like a memory she could never quite touch. As she reflected on the events of the past few weeks, her mind kept circling back to that painful moment when Jamal had chosen silence over justice. For so long, Elena had believed that exposing the truth was the only way to heal, but Jamal had shown her something else, something quieter but no less powerful. His decision to protect his fragile family from more pain had struck a deep chord within her. She leaned back, staring out the window, thinking about how things had unfolded. Jamal's courage wasn't loud or obvious, but it was real. In many ways, it reminded her of her brother. How Aaron had endured so much in silence, protecting her from the worst of their shared trauma. Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Maria, her colleague at the community center. "How's everything with Jamal and Deborah? Thinking about them today." "You good?" Elena smiled softly. It was nice to know that even in the midst of her own reflection, others were still thinking of her. She typed a quick reply, her fingers feeling lighter than they had in days. "We're getting there. I'll tell you more soon." She set the phone down, taking a deep breath. Things weren't perfect, but they were moving forward. She felt a deep connection to Jamal and his journey, one that made her understand that justice wasn't always about righting every wrong. Sometimes it was about finding peace in the wreckage. The next morning, Elena visited Jamal and Deborah at their apartment. The tension that had once filled the small space seemed to have lessened, replaced by a tentative sense of calm. Jamal was sitting at the kitchen table, sketching something on a piece of paper, while Deborah bustled around, making breakfast. "Good morning," Elena greeted them, her voice warm. Deborah smiled as she turned around. "Elena, it's good to see you." Jamal glanced up, offering a shy smile before returning to his drawing. Elena noticed the subtle shift in his demeanor. He seemed more relaxed, more comfortable in his own skin. It was a small but significant change. "I brought some books from the center," Elena said, holding up a small stack. "They're about dealing with grief and trauma. I thought they might help." Deborah wiped her hands on a towel and walked over, her expression grateful. "Thank you. We've been talking more about everything. It's not easy, but we're getting there." Elena nodded, her heart swelling with pride. "That's all you can do. Take it one step at a time." As they sat down at the table together, Elena noticed how Jamal occasionally glanced at his mother, as if looking for reassurance. Deborah would smile back at him, and in those quiet exchanges, Elena saw the beginnings of healing. They weren't rushing into forgiveness or pretending that things were fine, but they were facing their pain together, which was a victory in itself. "Have you heard from Frank?" Elena asked gently. Deborah's smile faded slightly, and she shook her head. "No, but that's okay. I think we all need some time apart to figure things out." Elena nodded, understanding. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but at least now, it felt like they were on the right path. A few days later, Deborah found a letter on her doorstep. It was addressed to her in Frank's familiar handwriting. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers trembling as she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The message was short, but it hit her like a weight. "Deborah, I'm sorry for everything. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I don't think I deserve it. I've made a lot of mistakes I can never take back. I've hurt you, Jamal, and so many others because I couldn't face my own shame. I've decided to leave the city. It's for the best. Maybe one day, when enough time has passed, we can try to talk again. But for now, I think it's better if I'm not around. Take care of yourself and Jamal. You're both stronger than I ever was. Dad." Deborah sat down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she reread the letter. A part of her had expected something like this, but seeing the words in front of her made it real. When Jamal came into the room and saw the letter, he looked at his mother with wide eyes. "What's that?" Deborah took a deep breath and handed him the letter. "It's from your grandfather. He's leaving the city." Jamal read the note silently, his face emotionless. When he finished, he set it down on the table and looked up at his mother. "Are you okay?" Deborah nodded slowly. "I don't know how to feel, honestly. I'm relieved, but there's still so much I wish we could have worked through." Jamal sat next to her, his voice steady. "We'll be okay, Mom. We don't need him." She smiled softly at her son's quiet strength, and for the first time in a long time, she believed him. Elena stood in front of the group of children at the community center, her heart full as she watched them engage in the new trauma program she had helped design. The program had been her way of channeling everything she had learned from working with Jamal, about silence, resilience, and healing. It wasn't just about giving kids a space to talk about their pain. It was about helping them find strength in their own way, whether through art, writing, or simply being with others who understood. Maria approached her from the side, a clipboard in hand. "This program is really something, Elena. The kids love it." Elena smiled, feeling a sense of pride that she hadn't felt in a long time. "It's not perfect, but it's a start. These kids have been through so much. They deserve a place to heal." Maria nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "And you? How are you healing?" Elena paused, considering the question. "I think I'm finally starting to make peace with things. Jamal taught me that healing doesn't always look the way you expect it to. It's not about finding justice for every wrong. It's about finding a way forward." Maria smiled warmly. "I'm proud of you, Elena." As the kids continued to work on their projects, Elena felt a sense of closure settling over her. She wasn't just helping them heal, she was healing too. A week later, Elena found herself back on the bus. She hadn't ridden the number 45 route since everything with Frank had come to a head, but today, she wanted to see Jamal. She sat in her usual seat, near the front, watching as the familiar stops passed by. When the bus pulled up to Jamal's stop, she saw him get on, his head held a little higher than before. He glanced around the bus, and for the first time, he didn't head to the back. Instead, he walked confidently to the front and took a seat near Elena. Their eyes met, and Jamal offered her a small, quiet smile. It wasn't much, but it spoke volumes. Elena smiled back, her heart swelling with pride. Jamal had found his own way to endure. He wasn't loud. He wasn't defiant in the way some might expect, but his courage was undeniable. As the bus continued down the familiar route, Elena leaned back in her seat, letting the hum of the engine wash over her. The weight she had carried for so long, the weight of her brother's death, of her need for justice, felt lighter now. Jamal had shown her that sometimes, the bravest thing you could do was to simply keep going, even when the world tried to break you. The bus rolled on, and in that quiet moment, Elena knew that while not every wound could be healed, they could all find a way to survive. The story ends with a quiet but powerful reflection on healing and resilience. Elena's journey is complete as she embraces her newfound purpose, helping children like Jamal find their own path to healing. Jamal's final act of sitting at the front of the bus symbolizes his quiet courage and growth, leaving both him and Elena with a sense of peace and hope for the future.